The Voyages of Ferdinand Magellan. The Magellan Expedition, also known as the Magellan-Elcano Expedition, was the first voyage around the world. In 1519, a Spanish expedition to the Moluccas, originally led by the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan, set sail from Spain. It was completed in 1522 by the Spanish navigator Juan Sebastián Elcano after crossing the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, reaching the first peak of circumnavigation of the world, to find a western route to the Moluccas, Spice Islands. The fleet left Spain on 20th September 1519 and crossed the Atlantic Ocean, sailing down the east coast of South America. They eventually discovered the Strait of Magellan, allowing them to cross into the Pacific Ocean, named after Magellan. The fleet completed its first Pacific crossing, stopping in the Philippines, and finally reached the Moluccas 2 years later. A depleted crew, led by Juan Sebastián Elcano, sailed westward across the Indian Ocean, then around the Cape of Good Hope, through Portuguese-controlled waters and northward along the West African coast, finally returning to Spain on 6th September 1522. The fleet began with 5 ships and about 270 men. The expedition faced numerous challenges, including sabotage attempts by Portugal, mutinies, famine, scurvy, storms, and hostile encounters with the indigenous population. Magellan died in battle in the Philippines and was replaced by a series of officers as Captain General, with Elcano eventually leading the Victoria's return voyage. The expedition was funded by King Charles I of Spain, who was certain that it would find a profitable western route to the Moluccas, as the eastern route was controlled by Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas. Although the expedition found a route, it was much longer and more difficult than expected, and therefore not commercially useful. Nevertheless, the expedition is considered one of the greatest maritime achievements and had a significant impact on Europeans' understanding of the world. The First Voyage. In March 1505, at the age of 25, Magellan enlisted in the fleet of 22 ships sent to host Francisco de Almeida as the first viceroy of Portuguese India. Although his name does not appear in the chronicles, it is known that he remained there for 8 years, in Goa, Cochin, and Quilon. He participated in several battles, including the Battle of Cananor in 1506, where he was wounded. In 1509, he fought in the Battle of Diu. King Charles I finances the voyage. After having his proposed expeditions to the Spice Islands repeatedly rejected by King Manuel of Portugal, Magellan turned to Charles I, the young King of Spain, and future Holy Roman Emperor. Portugal controlled the eastern routes to Asia that went around Africa under the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. Magellan proposed reaching the Spice Islands by a western route, a feat which had never been accomplished. Charles approved the expedition and provided most of the funding, confident that this would yield a commercially useful trade route for Spain. Departure. On 10th August 1519, Magellan's 5 ships left Seville and descended the Guadalquivir River to Sanlúcar de Barrameda at the mouth of the river. They remained there for more than 5 weeks. The fleet left Spain on 20th September 1519 and set sail west across the Atlantic Ocean toward South America. Magellan's fleet consisted of 5 ships, each carrying supplies for 2 years of travel. The crew numbered around 270 men. Most were Spanish, but around 40 were Portuguese. Rio de Janeiro. On 13th of December, the fleet reached Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Though nominally Portuguese territory, they maintained no permanent settlement there at the time. Magellan knew it would be safe to stop because he saw no Portuguese ships in the harbor. The fleet spent 13 days in Rio, during which they repaired their ships, stocked up on water and food, such as yam, cassava, and pineapple, and interacted with the locals. The expedition brought a great quantity of trinkets intended for trade, such as mirrors, combs, knives, and bells. The locals readily exchanged food and local goods, such as parrot feathers, for such items. The crew also found they could purchase sexual favors from the local women. Historian Ian Cameron was unequivocal in his description of the crew's time in Rio as a Saturnalia of feasting and lovemaking. On 27 December, the fleet left Rio de Janeiro. Pigafetta was unequivocal in his account of the natives' disappointment at their departure and their attempts to entice the Europeans to stay. Mutiny. After 3 months of searching, including a false start in the estuary of Rio de la Plata, the fleet was forced to stop their search to wait out the winter due to unfavorable weather conditions. They found a sheltered natural harbor at the port of St. Julian and remained there for 5 months. Shortly after landing at St. Julian, a mutiny attempt was led by the Spanish captains Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, and Luis de Mendoza. Magellan managed to quash the mutiny, despite losing control of 3 of his 5 ships to the mutineers. Mendoza was killed during the conflict, and Magellan sentenced Quesada and Cartagena to beheading and marooning, respectively. The lower-level conspirators were made to do hard labor in chains over the winter, but were later freed. Strait of Magellan. During the winter, one of the fleet's ships, the Santiago, was lost in a storm while surveying nearby waters. Despite this, no men were killed. In October 1520, the fleet resumed its search for a passage to the Pacific. 3 days later, they found a bay that led them to a strait, now known as the Strait of Magellan. This strait allowed them to pass through to the Pacific. One of the remaining 4 ships, the San Antonio, deserted the fleet and returned east to Spain. By the end of November 1520, the fleet had reached the Pacific. Magellan expected a short journey to Asia, perhaps taking as little as 3 or 4 days, based on the incomplete understanding of world geography at the time. In fact, the Pacific crossing took 3 months and 20 days. The long journey exhausted their supply of food and water, and around 30 men died, mostly of scurvy. Magellan himself remained healthy, undoubtedly thanks to his personal supply of preserved quince. Landfall. On 6 March 1521, the exhausted fleet made landfall at the island of Guam and were met by native Chamorro people who took items such as rigging, knives, and a ship's boat from the ships. The Chamorro people may have thought they were participating in a trade exchange, as they had already given the fleet some supplies, but the crew were certain that their actions were theft. Magellan sent a raiding party ashore to retaliate, killing several Chamorro men, burning their houses, and recovering the stolen goods. Philippines. On 16th March, the fleet reached the Philippines, where they would remain for a month and a half. Magellan befriended local leaders on the island of Limasawa and on 31st March held the first Mass in the Philippines, planting a cross on the island's highest hill. Magellan set about converting the locals to Christianity. Most readily accepted the new religion, but the island of Mactan resisted. Death in battle. On 27th April, Magellan and members of his crew attempted to subdue the Mactan natives by force. However, they were overpowered, and Magellan was killed by Lapu-Lapu, a native chieftain in Mactan. Indonesia. Following his death, Magellan was initially succeeded by co-commanders Juan Serrano and Duarte Barbosa, with a series of other officers later leading. The fleet left the Philippines after Raja Humabon betrayed them, and eventually made their way to the Moluccas in November 1521. They set sail in December laden with spices for Spain. However, only one of their remaining 2 ships, the Victoria, was seaworthy. Rounding the Cape. The Victoria set sail via the Indian Ocean route home on 21st December 1521, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano. By 6th May 1522, the Victoria had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, with only rice for rations. Starvation. 20 crewmen died of starvation by 9th of July 1522, when Elcano put into Portuguese Cape Verde for provisions. The crew were astonished to discover that the date was in fact 10 of July 1522, as they had recorded every day of the 3-year journey without fail, They made purchases without difficulty, using the cover story that they were returning to Spain from the Americas. However, the Portuguese detained 13 crew members after discovering that Victoria was carrying spices from the East Indies. The Victoria managed to escape with its cargo of 26 tons of spices, cloves, and cinnamon. Voyage home. On 6 September 1522, Elcano and the remaining crew of Magellan's voyage arrived in Sanlúcar de Barrameda in Spain aboard Victoria, almost exactly 3 years after they departed. They then sailed upriver to Seville, and from there overland to Valladolid, where they appeared before the emperor. When Victoria, the sole surviving ship and the smallest carrack in the fleet, returned to the harbor of departure after completing the first circumnavigation of the earth, only 18 men out of the original 270 men were on board. In addition to the returning Europeans, the Victoria had aboard 3 Moluccans who came aboard at Tidore. Epilogue. Magellan is renowned for his navigational skill and tenacity. The first circumnavigation has been rightly called the greatest sea voyage in the Age of Discovery, and even the most important maritime voyage ever undertaken. Over time, appreciation of Magellan's accomplishments has been enhanced by the failure of subsequent expeditions, which attempted to retrace his route, beginning with the Loaiza expedition in 1525, which featured Juan Sebastián Elcano as second in command. The next expedition to successfully complete a circumnavigation, led by Francis Drake, would not occur until 1580, 58 years after the return of the Victoria. Magellan named the Pacific Ocean, which was also often called the Sea of Magellan in his honor until the 18th century. Magellan is also responsible for naming the Strait of Magellan. Despite not surviving the trip, he has received more recognition for the expedition than Elcano. This is because Magellan was the one who started it, Portugal wanted to recognize a Portuguese explorer, and Spain feared Basque nationalism.
We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.